Welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving into a really heavy topic today, the Atlantic slave trade. You guys send in some excerpts, and wow, there's a lot there.
Yeah, it's a part of history that a lot of people try to simplify, but it's really complex and honestly pretty disturbing.
So where do we even start with something as huge as the Atlantic slave trade?
Well, I think you got to start by understanding just how big it was. This wasn't just one place, one event. This was a massive network across continents, connecting Africa, Europe, and the Americas in a really, really horrible way.
Yeah, the sources really show that. This wasn't just a local thing. It really was transatlantic.
Mm.
But they also make it clear that all this demand for enslaved labor, it wasn't for just any kind of work. This was about those cash crops, those plantations making huge profits.
Exactly. Sugarcane, tobacco, cotton, those were driving the economies of these European colonies,
Yeah.
and the demand for labor is just never ending.
So the Americas, they had the land and the demand. Europe had the money and the ships. But where did the labor come from?
That's where things get tricky. The source makes it pretty clear. This wasn't just Europeans showing up in Africa and forcing slavery onto people who had no idea it was coming. It was way more complicated.
Okay, what do you mean by complicated?
Well, you have to understand, there were already systems of slavery and warfare in Africa. Europeans didn't invent them, but they took advantage of them. They made them worse, used them for their own profit. And that's a really important point because it shows just how complicated things were, how some Africans were involved in this terrible history.
That's interesting, but also really disturbing. It definitely changes that simple story a lot of us probably learned in school.
Yeah.
Are there any examples of how they made those pre-existing systems worse?
Absolutely. The source mentions how the demand for slaves led to more conflicts in Africa. Crimes that might have been punished differently before European traders came along, suddenly those crimes were punished by being sold into slavery.
So the demand for slaves changed the laws and even the social structure of Africa. That's a huge impact.
And that leads to another really troubling part of this story, the role of religion.
Yeah, I was reading about that. It's hard to believe that they used religion to justify enslaving millions of people.
It's a perfect example of how people twist beliefs to support their own power and greed. The sources talk about these papal bulls from the 15th century. They actually gave European nations the right to enslave non-Christians.
So they weren't just taking people by force, they were actually trying to make it sound like a good thing.
Exactly. These papal statements, things like Dum Diversas and Romanus Pontifex, they basically said the slave trade was a moral mission to convert pagans to Christianity. It was all a cover-up to make this system of exploitation seem okay.
It's crazy how they could make something so awful seem right. Did these papal bulls actually make the slave trade get bigger? I mean, what impact did they have?
That's a great question. And historians still debate it. I mean, the bulls didn't create the demand for slaves themselves, but they definitely made it easier for people to accept the trade. It helped them ignore their conscience and made the system seem legit to everyone in Europe.
It's scary to think they used religious authority to justify those terrible acts.
It reminds us to always question how people use beliefs and ideas to hold on to their power and oppress others. But let's look at the numbers here for a second. This wasn't just a few people. This was millions of lives destroyed.
Yeah, it's hard to even wrap your head around how many people were affected. The sources say that historians think over 12 million Africans were taken across the Atlantic between the 16th and 19th centuries.
And that number doesn't even include those who died being captured, or during that horrific journey, the Middle Passage, or even after they got to the Americas and were forced to work. It's impossible to measure the true cost in human life.
It's just heartbreaking. I have to admit, I'm not really sure what Middle Passage means. Could you explain that a bit more?
Sure, the Middle Passage was the name for the journey across the Atlantic. Those enslaved Africans were forced onto ships, packed in with almost no air, hardly any food or water, disease spreading everywhere. It's estimated that at least 15%, maybe more, of them died just during the trip.
That's just awful. To be taken from your home, chained up, and shoved onto a ship with no idea where you're going or what's going to happen to you, I can't even imagine.
And that leads to something really important the source points out. The role Africans played in the slave trade. It wasn't just Europeans forcing their will on a helpless continent. It was way more complicated than that.
Yeah, the source mentions African kings and elites participating in the trade. To be honest, that surprised me. I always thought Europeans were the only ones to blame.
It's a tough part of history to talk about, but it's the truth. Some African kingdoms and elites did take part in the trade. A lot of times it was because of practices they already had, like war and enslavement. Or sometimes it was just for the money. They saw it as a way to get rich, gain power, and get goods from Europe.
So there were really African leaders who thought the slave trade was a good thing. That's not something I ever thought about before.
It's a difficult and uncomfortable truth, but it's important to remember that wasn't the only way Africans felt. Along with those who took part, there were tons of people who resisted the slave trade.
So it wasn't like the whole continent just went along with what Europe wanted.
Not at all. The source talks about all sorts of ways Africans fought back. They disrupted trade routes, they organized rebellions, they even begged European leaders to stop it.
Wow, that's amazing. Can you tell me more about those acts of resistance? I'd love to hear how they fought back against such a powerful system.
Absolutely. One of the most powerful examples happened in the Caribbean. And that brings us to the Haitian Revolution. It's one of the most important events in the history of slavery.
Okay, I've heard the name before, but I don't really know much about it. What made it so important?
Well, it was a slave revolt that actually worked. It started in 1791 on a French colony called Saint-Domingue. It's Haiti now. Enslaved Africans, led by people like Toussaint Louverture, they fought back against their oppressors, and in 1804, they won their independence.
So it wasn't just a rebellion, they actually formed their own country.
Wow. Yeah, and it scared slaveholders all over the Americas. It showed them that enslaved people weren't just going to sit there and take it. They could organize, they could resist, and they could win.
I can see why that would shake things up. Did the Haitian Revolution actually affect the fight against slavery anywhere else?
Totally. The source says that some abolitionists started arguing that ending the slave trade was the only way to prevent more uprisings like Haiti. And that fear, along with more and more people in Europe who were against slavery for moral reasons, it really started to push for change.
So the Haitian Revolution wasn't just about Haitians getting their freedom. It helped speed up the movement to end slavery in Europe, too.
Exactly. It forced people to look at how brutal slavery was and what might happen if they ignored the demands for justice and freedom. But even beyond that, the Haitian Revolution is just an incredible example of resistance and people fighting for the right to determine their own future. It's a story of courage, resilience, and people working together to make change happen.
Sounds like something everyone should know about. It really flips the script on that idea that enslaved people were just helpless victims.
And speaking of flipping the script, not all resistance was these big organized revolts. There were lots of ways that enslaved people resisted every single day. The source talks about things like slowing down their work, sabotaging things, even running away.
So even when they couldn't have a full-blown rebellion, they still found ways to fight back.
Absolutely. They refused to let the system completely break them. They held on to their dignity and humanity any way they could, and those acts of resistance, big and small, they all helped to weaken the system from the inside.
That's really powerful. It shows how people can resist, even in the worst conditions.
Yeah.
But the source also gets into how the slave trade affected the economy. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, it's complicated, but it's important to understand how tied up the slave trade was with the world economy.
One thing that stood out to me was just how big the trade was.
Yeah.
The source compares the trans-Saharan slave trade, which lasted for 12 centuries and involved maybe 11.5 to 14 million people, to the Atlantic slave trade, which was only a few centuries but moved at least 12 million Africans.
That's a huge difference. It shows just how brutal and efficient the Atlantic slave trade was. It was all driven by that demand for labor on those cash crop plantations in the Americas.
And it wasn't just any kind of labor, was it? The sources say it was all about specific crops.
You got it. Sugarcane was a big one. It took a lot of work to grow, and the profits were massive. You could say sugar was the fuel that kept the Atlantic slave trade going.
So our desire for sugar was directly connected to millions of people being enslaved. That's hard to think about.
It is. And it wasn't just sugar. The source also talks about tobacco, cocoa, cotton, and all sorts of other products that were made using slave labor. These things powered the economies of European empires and changed how people in Europe lived.
It's crazy to think how important the slave trade was to the world's economy. It wasn't just something on the side. It was a driving force for centuries.
And that economic reality was a big part of why the slave trade was finally abolished. The moral arguments are important, but things were changing in the economy too, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, for one thing, slavery wasn't making as much money anymore. New technologies and the changing economy meant that some industries didn't need slave labor as much.
So ending slavery wasn't just a moral victory. There were economic reasons, too.
Definitely. The source hints at that, but it's important to highlight. It wasn't just a sudden change of heart. It was this big, complicated process. You had the economics changing, politics, and people getting scared of more revolts like the Haitian Revolution.
Good point. Things are rarely simple when you look back in history.
Hmm.
There's always a bunch of things going on.
Exactly. And when it comes to the economics of the slave trade, the source gets into some interesting details. It talks about how European traders didn't usually go too far into Africa themselves.
Why not? Was it too dangerous?
You got it. They were scared of getting sick and of resistance from people living there. So instead of capturing people themselves, they set up trading posts on the coast and waited for African traders and warlords to bring them captives.
So they basically created this system that encouraged people to capture and sell other human beings. That's just awful.
And that system had ripple effects. The source talks about how it fueled conflict in Africa, with different groups fighting over who got to be part of the slave trade.
It's like they made a market for human beings and then just sat back and watched as it tore apart African societies.
It's a tragic truth. And the source gives some really powerful firsthand accounts of how bad it was. It quotes the King of Congo, Nzinga Mbemba Afonso. He wrote a letter to the King of Portugal saying how worried he was about what the slave trade was doing to his people.
What did he say?
He said his kingdom was losing people, that the stuff coming from Europe was making the slave trade worse and destroying his people. He even begged the King of Portugal to stop sending goods and just send missionaries instead.
Wow, that's so sad. It sounds like he was trying everything he could to stop the cycle of exploitation.
It's a powerful statement against the whole system, coming from someone who was seeing its terrible effects firsthand. And it shows how complicated things were for African leaders. Some, like the King of Dahomey, chose to be part of the trade, while others, like the King of Congo, tried everything they could to fight it.
So we see that struggle between working with the Europeans and resisting them happening within Africa, too.
Exactly. The slave trade wasn't just this one force, it created this whole web of relationships, alliances, and conflicts that change African societies forever.
It reminds us that history isn't black and white. It's full of shades of gray. And understanding those nuances is really important to getting the whole picture. But speaking of details, I'm curious about how they actually transported all those people across the Atlantic. What were the ships like?
The source talks about that too. It describes how terrible the conditions were on those slave ships. People crammed in tight spaces, no air, no sanitation. It's truly horrifying.
I can't even imagine. It must have been pure hell.
It was. And the source emphasizes how that dehumanization was a key part of the system. It let those traders justify those terrible conditions on the ships and the awful way they treated enslaved people once they got to the Americas. They saw them as cargo, not people. The focus was on getting them there cheap and fast.
That's really disturbing, but it's important to understand just how cruel the whole thing was.
But it wasn't just about cruelty, was it? There was disease, too, right? The source mentions how Europeans couldn't handle malaria, which was everywhere in Africa. Right. That's a really interesting part of the story. Europeans being so vulnerable to malaria really shaped how the trade worked. It kept them from going too far into Africa, so they had to rely on Africans to get them their captives.
So a disease actually helped shape the slave trade.
It did. It made Europeans dependent on African collaborators, and that gave those collaborators some power in the system. But it also meant that those enslaved Africans were exposed to all sorts of new diseases during the Middle Passage, crammed together on those ships with no sanitation. So many of them died.
Crazy how disease changed history, and not always in a good way. But it wasn't just Africans who were affected by disease, right? The source mentions that Native Americans were really vulnerable to European diseases too.
Absolutely. When Europeans came to the Americas and when Africans were brought there, they brought diseases like smallpox with them. And that was devastating for the indigenous populations. They had no immunity, and it was a disaster.
So the slave trade wasn't just about exploiting African labor. It really hurt the Native Americans too.
Exactly. It's all connected. The arrival of Europeans, the forced migration of Africans, the spread of disease, the displacement of indigenous people, it's all woven together. And that complexity continues as we look at where all those enslaved Africans were taken and how it changed the economies and societies of the Americas. And that's how we get to the Americas. When all those enslaved Africans arrived, it changed everything, the economy, society, the whole landscape.
Yeah, the sources really get into where all those enslaved Africans were taken in the Americas, especially the Caribbean.
The Caribbean islands were a huge part of the Atlantic slave trade. Millions of enslaved Africans were taken there, mostly to work on those sugar plantations. And we talked about how profitable those were for the European colonizers.
The Caribbean was basically the center of the sugar world, which, like we said, fueled the whole Atlantic slave trade. It's hard to imagine how much suffering happened on those islands.
The source doesn't sugarcoat it. It says that Cuba, for example, was the biggest slave colony in all of Hispanic America. They brought in something like 800,000 enslaved Africans.
800,000 people. That's just, it's hard to even wrap your head around that number.
And the source goes on to describe how these enslaved people in the Caribbean were working these crazy long days, like 16-hour days on those sugar plantations, with terrible conditions and brutal treatment.
It's amazing that they were even able to survive, let alone hold on to their own cultural traditions in a place that tried so hard to dehumanize them.
That's a really important point. Despite all the horrors they went through, enslaved Africans in the Caribbean found ways to preserve their culture and adapt it. They created new forms of music, religion, ways of expressing themselves. It was a mix of their African heritage and elements of European culture.
The source specifically mentions African diaspora religions developing in the Caribbean.
Exactly. These religions often mixed West African beliefs with Christianity. They gave enslaved people a sense of community, identity, and spiritual strength. It was a source of hope and a way to resist in a world that was trying to take away their humanity.
It's incredible how, even when they were being oppressed, they found ways to connect with their culture and spirituality.
It really shows the power of the human spirit. But the Caribbean wasn't just about suffering and cultural change. It was also a place of resistance. We talked about the Haitian Revolution, but there were other ways they resisted too.
The source mentions something called maroon communities. What were those?
Maroon communities were groups of escaped slaves who lived in remote areas, up in the mountains or deep in the forests where colonial authorities couldn't reach them. They made their own self-governing communities and sometimes even raided plantations for supplies or to free other enslaved people.
So they were basically creating their own little pockets of freedom within a system that was all about keeping them enslaved.
Exactly. They were a real problem for those in charge and a powerful symbol of resistance. Just by existing, they challenged the idea that enslaved people were happy with their situation or couldn't fight back.
It's inspiring to think about these communities finding their own freedom in such a harsh environment.
And their legacy still inspires movements for social justice and self-determination today. But as we wrap up this deep dive, we have to talk about the lasting impact of the slave trade. We see its consequences all around the world, from economic disparities to racial inequalities.
It's not just history, it's still very much a part of our world.
The source really highlights how the slave trade depopulated Africa. Some historians say that sub-Saharan Africa had about 18% of the world's population in 1600, but by 1900 it was only 6%.
That's a huge drop. It's hard to imagine the scale of the loss and how disruptive that must have been.
And it wasn't just about the numbers. The source also talks about how the slave trade messed up the balance between men and women. In some parts of Africa, women made up as much as 65% of the population because so many men were taken as slaves.
Wow. A shift like that must have had a big impact on social structures, family life, the economy.
Absolutely. It disrupted families, how people worked, and the whole social order. And those changes probably still affect African societies today.
It reminds us that the slave trade didn't just cause immediate suffering. Its effects lasted for generations. And those consequences weren't limited to Africa, right?
Nope, not at all. The source also talks about the impact on the Americas, and it goes beyond just the economic side of things. It really shaped the way American societies and cultures developed.
That's a big claim. Can you explain what you mean?
Think about the music, the food, the religious practices, even the languages spoken in the Americas. They've all been influenced in some way by all those Africans who were forced to come here, and the mix of African and European cultures that happened as a result. It's a complicated legacy, often painful, but it also shows how resilient and creative the African diaspora is.
It's a good reminder that even when faced with horrible suffering, people find ways to create, connect, and build something new.
Which brings us to another important part of the slave trade's legacy, the fight to abolish it and the ongoing struggle for racial justice.
The source mentions the abolitionist movement in Europe, especially groups like the Quakers and people like William Wilberforce.
The Quakers, with their belief that everyone is equal, were some of the first and most outspoken people against slavery. They played a big role in making people aware of the horrors of the slave trade and getting the public to oppose it.
And William Wilberforce was a British politician who spent his life trying to abolish the slave trade. He used his position in Parliament to expose how brutal it was and push for laws to change it.
His work, along with the work of countless other abolitionists, eventually led to the Slave Trade Act of 1807. That law abolished the slave trade in the British Empire. It was a huge victory, but like we talked about, it didn't immediately end slavery in British colonies. That happened later with the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833.
And even then, the fight for racial justice didn't stop when slavery was abolished. The effects of the slave trade are still here today, in the form of racism built into our systems, economic inequality, and the continued fight for equality and recognition.
You're absolutely right. The fight against slavery isn't over. It's still going on in the fight for racial justice, economic equality, and basic human rights for everyone. It's a fight that needs our attention, our empathy, and our active participation.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive. We've explored the horrible reality of the Atlantic slave trade, from its beginnings to its eventual abolition, and the complex and lasting impact it's had.
It's a part of history that often gets oversimplified or ignored. But as we've seen, it's a story full of complexity, nuance, and uncomfortable truths. It's a story that demands our attention, our critical thinking, and our commitment to building a fairer and more just world.
And as you continue to learn about this topic, we encourage you to really think about the information you find. Look for different perspectives and think about the ways this history is still shaping our world today. For example, think about how the transatlantic slave trade influenced how we understand race and racial identity. It's a complicated and challenging question, but it's essential if we want to understand how the legacy of slavery is still with us today.
That's something to really think about. The Atlantic slave trade isn't just a chapter in a history book. It's a story that's still being written, and we all have a part to play in how it ends.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a better understanding of the Atlantic slave trade and encouraged you to keep learning about this important and complicated chapter in human history.